have with me on Liberty Dispatch interviews friend of the show, Jonathan Wellum. Jonathan is the founder and CEO of Rocklinc Investment Partners. You are well acquainted with this organization. They began in 2009 as an independent, research driven investment management firm focusing solely on creating portfolios of high quality assets. He also serves as an elder at Trinity Baptist Church in Burlington, Ontario. Jonathan's been married to his wife Heidi for 32 years. They have 4 adult children. They also have 1 son in law, 1 daughter in law, and recently welcomed their 2nd grandchild. Jonathan holds a Bachelor of Commerce and a Master of Business Administration degree from McMaster University and a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Waterloo. He also completed a Master of Arts degree from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He holds the designation of Chartered Financial Analyst. Jonathan, thanks so much for joining me on the show. It's great to have you.
Well, it's great to be back on the show, Andrew. I love the program. I love what you guys are doing, and it's a privilege to be able to talk on the show and deal with some of these very important topics.
So the reason why I wanted to have you on specifically relates to an article that you wrote recently, and you shared it with me privately, and I read it, and I thought not only is this researched and sourced and historically accurate, but it is biblically based, it is sound. And I found myself saying, I don't know how many kind of financial management, investment management companies out there would release an article like this on their website, which is why I love you guys so much, because this is something that's right on your website at the top of your newsroom page. And so I thought this is something I want to talk about because I think it accurately describes what's happening in Canada, what we see happening in trends over history, and is something we need to see, recognize, and deal with and respond to, because the consequences of what you're addressing in the article are rather significant for nations, but also individuals within those nations who deal in the finances and in the currency of those nations. So in your article early on about moral decline leading to currency collapse, you write these words, and I can imagine here you're drawing on, you're hearkening on a little bit of R.C. Sproul. At least that's what I thought when I read these first words here. I read it in his voice in the final analysis, right? In the final analysis, it's just central banks printing money, reducing its value and causing inflation as they support dishonest governments that refuse to be fiscally responsible and continually run massive deficits. Such policies flow from the elites' greed and their insatiable thirst for power, benefiting themselves at the expense of the middle class and the working poor. History and scripture show that moral decay leads to excessive spending, money printing, inflation, and eventually currency collapse. So we see those 2 realities. We see a clear moral decline in Canada, and we also see a currency collapse, and we also see economic degradation. And in your article, you trace that it's not just correlation, but it's causation. One causes the other. So as you're writing this, as you're thinking about events and examples in history, what are you drawing from historically to point to and say, here's another example of moral decay equaling currency collapse. Oh, and here's another one. What were some of these sources you were drawing from?
Yeah, great question. And what really interests me in writing this particular article this time is that we've seen gold and silver and some of the hard assets go up quite a bit, including even Bitcoin and so on. And a lot of people are writing, a lot of secular folks are writing that once your currency starts to weaken, you see that leads to moral problems in the society. I kept reading this. And I think to myself, no, it's actually the other way around. The reason we have problems with our currency and devaluation of our currency and inflation in the society and so forth is because there's been moral choices made over decades that's led to these problems. And so it kind of frustrated me a little bit. So I went back to the scriptures and back to, of course, our theological base, which is going to give us a base of truth that God's given us his revelation, which speaks to the world that he's made, which is the real world, the created order. And I always go back to Isaiah 1, where I started my paper, the article. And God is, again, laying out the condemnation and the wickedness and the evil of Judah. and the fact that one of the things that he recognizes in this evil, unjust, unrighteous society is that they are diluting down their currency, and so they're watering down their silver coins, and they're making the silver content less and less. So basically, you're printing money, the same thing that we do. We can do it a little bit more efficiently, of course, with digitization and digital money. But it's the Lord condemning these people for an unjust and unrighteous society, which is punishing the poor, inflicting pain on the widowless, the widows, I should say, and the fatherless, and so forth. And so it started me again thinking through that as we look down through history, we'll see that as societies live beyond their means, as rulers want to promise things that they can't pay for, citizens want to accept things that they shouldn't be accepting because they didn't work for it, then the easiest thing to do is for the government to make promises, to start spending beyond their means. And in order to do that, though, they have to get the money out there. Eventually, they have to print the money. They can't have it collateralized or backed by something physical, which limits the amount of money they can print. And so when you go back in history, in fact, you see this repetitively. You see it over and over again as societies become increasingly evil and socialistic, and the government becomes larger and larger and the private sector becomes smaller. Inevitably, you're not producing the wealth, but you want to redistribute things. And of course, if you want to redistribute things and you're not producing it, then you think you can sort of create something out of nothing. You typically get into money printing. So in my article, I talk about the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is a classic case of over a number of decades, in fact, centuries, the silver content and the gold content in their coins, especially in the denarius, it started to go down. So you can actually go on Google, you can look at charts, and it'll show you the silver content going from 95% all the way down to virtually nothing by the end of the second century. And what was happening? Wars, violence, emperors living beyond their means, all of the things that we see, overtaxation. Of course, the government never has enough money. They always are taxing more. So you see these things reoccurring, and eventually you get a currency collapse. Interestingly enough, in the third century, the Roman century, Christianity started to make a much stronger impact on the society. And Diocletian, he actually brought back the silver content back up to about 95% and restored a lot of strength back in the currency again because he brought rigor, he brought discipline to the situation. Later on in history, I mentioned the French situation, but we could look we could look at a number of cases all down through history where we see governments. They start off well. Their currency is usually backed one for one with a hard asset. Therefore, you just can't print it unless you back up with a hard asset. So you have collateral, but it doesn't take long before they start spending more than they should. They get into wars maybe they shouldn't be in. They're going to fund the war. They want to then start taxing people more. They get into more regulations. They get into more involvement in the economy. The wealth production starts to slow down, but people are demanding things and they start to print the money. And eventually you create inflation because you now have more money chasing less goods. So you just bid up the prices of the goods and inflation starts to hit and your standard of living starts to collapse and away you go. Modern day examples, Zimbabwe or Rhodesia, you've seen it down in Africa, many of the African countries, Venezuela. We saw it in Argentina recently, where you had rampant inflation because of overspending and killing the private sector. And so the public sector became larger and larger, but they don't produce wealth. And so they just printed money and they created inflation. Standards of living started to collapse and so forth. And the president down there now, Malay, he's trying to reverse all that. Well, what does he do? Stop spending the money, start to balance budgets, start to get more confidence back in the currency, drive up the private sector, start to produce more goods and services and producing wealth. Therefore, you can export more. People demand your currency. They rise. The value of your currency starts to rise instead of going down. These are all the things that you see out there in the world. And again, it shows that as Christians, we understand this, that the economics are going to be definitely 100% correlated to the morality of the society. And so as the morality goes, as the virtue of people go, so goes the economy. And you cannot separate the two. I think that the price of your money and the stability of your purchasing power is a great barometer of the ethics and the morality in the culture. There's no way you can maintain purchasing power and standards of living in an immoral economy. And this is just axiomatic because that's God's world. It's God's universe. And if you don't follow the principles of the scripture and the biblical proverbs, that of course lay out all these wonderful, wonderful principles, then you're going to see economic slide, and you're not going to be producing much, and you're going to start going after your neighbor, and you're going to start to want something that you didn't earn, and the whole cycle just speeds up on itself until it just unwinds completely. Yeah.
And you were referencing the economists that you were reading that were talking about the currency collapse or the economic decline leading to moral decline. And they're correct in that obviously one fuels the other, but they're incorrect in their starting point. And one of the things I appreciated about your article was, even though you're zooming in primarily on the currency collapse and what happens economically, more broadly, it is the case that the rejection of the rule of God in a society will lead to the moral decay of the society, which will lead to a whole host of problems. Economic is just one of them. Before we got on, I was thinking about uh, someone that has talked about the end of civilizations, where civilizations reach their decadent phase, and then eventually we see they come to an end, whether it's Rome, whether it's Greece, whether it's what we see. It's funny, even the way certain movies and television shows project this, but one of the things we see when civilizations enter their decadent phase is the necessity of the male female distinction begins to go away, because when a society is very decadent, it's not fighting wars anymore. Therefore, you don't need the strong men to defend the gates. You also don't need the strong men to build the infrastructure. Everything's built. So the necessity of the male female distinction isn't there among the non believers. So eventually, societies in their decadent phase become androgynous, and they start to flatten out the distinctions between men and women. And this is also another marker that leads to the collapse of these civilizations. And so these are all these, your article is just one touch point to show us what we know to be true, which the world doesn't see. The world thinks that it's ultimately bad policy or the wrong person that leads to the decline. But we see that it's ultimately the rejection of the rule and the law of God that lead to all of these collapses and all of these breakdowns and all of these spheres of society. And I was just thankful for your article to highlight from a primarily economic currency perspective where we see that happening. So my question for you then is, how Canada right now, how are we following the pattern? Right? So what are the what are some of the decisions we've made, right? So I think we can trace a clear moral decline. It doesn't take a theologian or a historian to look at the last 10 years in Canada and trace a, a little bit of a moral decline, even if we brought it out to 50 years. So that's been happening. Now, how was that translated to our currency collapse, which is it's on life support, and even our more broad economic situation? How do we fit into your article right now in history?
Yeah, and let me just follow up with one additional point that flows right out of what you've said. The family unit itself is the most important structure in the society. You break that down, it's the greatest bulwark against totalitarianism. Strong family units, of course, united in communities and especially in churches, don't need much government. You don't need government telling you to do very much. It's when you break down that home and you break down those roles, males and females, as you have laid out the way God has done it, that the state then comes in and becomes God and takes over more and more control. We have seen that in spades in the West. And so that is one of the foundational deviating points that has caused, again, our economic challenges. Because as the family breaks down, we're not self sufficient. We're not looking after ourselves. We're not creating the virtues and the education and the moral underpinnings and virtue teaching, especially from the scriptures in the family. Then that translates out into society into people who really are not equipped to deal with the real world. And they look to the state as God, and the state's going to be their protection. It's going to look after them, so forth.
And
And you get
this is in everything. Like, if you don't do your job as parents, the state will step in and educate your children. If you don't do your job, my wife and I were talking about this recently. It's been a long time since anyone in our family has had to go fill out a prescription or go to the hospital. And in part, it's because we've tried to be intentional with what we eat and how we operate, and not to just fill our bodies with whatever kind of medication they throw us. So if you don't do your job within the family unit, then the state will have to step in and take care of you from a healthcare perspective. So in all spheres, when the family doesn't do its job, you're right to point out that the state is more than happy to fill in that gap and say, we'll be your teacher, we'll give you an allowance, we'll take care of your health care. We got you. We'll entertain you. We'll make sure that you have all the information and care that you need. And that's no good. That's no bueno for a society.
Yeah, because what happens again? So go back to the back to our point in terms of currency, and let me just point out, as I do in the article, a lot of people don't realize that we've been seeing a tremendous erosion in purchasing power in Canada, in the United States, for the last 50, 60 years, like substantial currency erosion. And what I point out in the article is that if you use gold as a barometer, and gold's a great barometer because it basically is just money. It's not really supposed to grow. It's just to maintain purchasing power ultimately over long periods of time. So if you go back and you look at the price of gold in 1971, and we'll talk about the U.S. dollar because our dollar is pretty well linked with the U.S. dollar. If you look at that, it was $35 an ounce. You know, gold today is trading at over $3,300 an ounce, which tells you that we've lost, 98 to 99% of our purchasing power against gold. And people go, well, really, you think we've lost the purchasing? Yeah, you have. If you look at real estate, you look at other hard assets over the last 60, 50, 60 years, you've basically lost 95% of your purchasing power. In other words, you could buy real estate at 5% of the value you could in the early 70s is what you could buy now in many cases. And so people don't realize that the deficit spending, which really came on very strongly, as I point out in the article, and it's in a very brief article, but if you look at the United States, the debt in the United States was less than $400 billion. It was like $300 billion back in 1971. Today it's 37 trillion. And so you've had like this 95-fold increase in the debt. 95. The economy has maybe gone up. Well, the economy back then would have been a couple trillion, and now it's about 30, about 30 trillion. So the economy would maybe go up by 15 times, the debt by 90 times. Okay, so the economy is not growing anywhere near the debt. So we've been living way beyond our means. So we see this in Canada, the same thing in the United States. The United States is very important because that's the reserve currency of the world. So this is your benchmark currency. If the benchmark currency is eroding at that kind of value, then of course these other currencies around the world have eroded even more in many cases. And so people need to realize we're living through currency collapse now. Okay, now that can speed up very quickly. And I think this is the concern that we have as investment managers and Canadians should be concerned about is that, okay, if you're losing 3, 4, 5% a year, and you do that for 50 years, you've lost a lot of purchasing power, especially if incomes don't keep up with it because you don't have a productive economy. But what I'm concerned about now is we're getting near the end of this debt cycle. So our debts now are so large that our the interest that we're paying on our debt is something that's really driving our deficits now.
What
In
is
other
it? I
words,
was watching a video from the taxpayer federations. What is it, like $90 billion a year is the interest alone on our debt? $94 billion, something like that.
yeah, we're starting to approach about $100 billion a year. It's a large number. In the United States, it's over $1 trillion. This is why Donald Trump's trying to get the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates because they have to roll over $10 trillion in the next 12 months. If you're rolling them over from 1.5% interest to 4% interest, you can imagine how much that's going to cost you. So we're at this point now where we got the debt to GDP, our production is so large, it's just become so large. All these deficits have added up over decades so that we really can't get out of this. It's sort of a debt spiral that we're in. And so what's going to happen, in my view, is that they're going to continue to print more money. And they're going to then devalue our currency. And once you lose confidence in the currency, it can really drop quickly. As I think this is what's concerning me. But this has been coming for decades and decades. What's built up? The erosion of the family unit. You've got our educational institutions gutting all of the Christian teaching of virtues and morality. You've got governments promising things that they should not be involved in. The state becoming bigger and bigger and promising free things. Free. There's nothing free. Our free healthcare, free education, free social services, free welfare. It just continues to go and go. Our government used to be 20% of our total value of our production of goods every year. Now it's almost 50%. And so government gets bigger and bigger. And then on top of that, Andrew, it's not like it says we want to get bigger, but we want to make sure we're producing lots of wealth. It cripples the private sector. So it puts regulation on regulation on regulation. We can see in Canada, we can't get any big projects done, and we're a resource country. I mean, we don't manufacture much. We manufacture a few things, but we're basically a country of resources, of agriculture, lumber, hydro production of energy, uranium, oil, gas, gold, nickel, silver, all of these things. And if we're not digging holes and extracting these things and selling them to the world, our standard of living is going to collapse. And so now we've got all the green agenda and all of these coming. People start to worship the earth. So again, you see, there's a religion here where all of a sudden, instead of having dominion over the earth and being stewards under God's rule over Christ, under Christ's rule, we then think we're going to rule it and we control everything, and we get into worshiping the earth, and we're not going to develop our resources. Well, if you don't develop our resources, you're not going to produce anything, right? And so you can see how it snowballs. And how do you produce your money? Well, you just print more money. You don't actually produce wealth. And so that's the cycle that we've gotten ourselves in. And it's all tied to a complete rejection of God's truth, a complete rejection of Genesis 1 to 3 and what God has laid out for us in mandate, and a complete rejection, really, of the redemption that we need in Christ, and the whole change of heart and regenerate heart. And the virtues are obviously are going to emanate from that, understanding our sinfulness and understanding our need to depend on God and to look to Him and to humbly approach every day under His lordship. And so this is what we've seen, and this is what we're seeing unwind in our own country. And a great barometer of that is your purchasing power. And that's why I sort of point out in the article, as you say, there's so many things you could look at, but the purchasing power in your money is just a great weight or measure to say, what's the yardstick here? This is not working out. And ultimately, these are all ethical and moral issues in our country.
And you mentioned, you mentioned the word virtue or virtuous twice, and I'm glad you did, because people think, and even sad to say, in many evangelical circles, then one of the reasons why there's an aversion to talk about money and wealth. So whether it's giving to the church, which is commanded by God for our good and for His glory, or wealth management. This is one of the things that, by and large, I think the evangelical church has been silent about. And the reason that's so disheartening is because apparently in the church and very much in the world, they think that the way we relate to and the way we steward our money is really just a matter of utilitarianism. It's about making sure that we have enough to give to our kids or retire and don't go into too much debt. And it's really just about fiscal management. But the truth is, how we handle our money is a matter of virtue. Do we worship it? Do we believe that it will provide for us? Are we honest with it? Do we steward it well? And so, approaching our money, so whether it's a nation's economy or individually, my spending, my saving, it's not, we cannot just look at it from a utilitarian number in the red and the black perspective, because that will, if that's the case, then you're right, just print more money, right? If we're just looking at it from a what do we need to do to get through this difficult time, we'll just print more money and that'll get us through. Yeah, but what about the future? That's the future's problem. We'll print more money in the future. But if we see, no, this is an issue of virtue. How you handle your money is a moral issue. You're either honoring the Lord or you're not honoring the Lord with the way you handle your money. And as I was reading your article, I was glad that you drew biblical principles and that you made the clear case from the scriptures, because one of the things I hope that we see coming out of this economic collapse in the West, among other kind of resurgences, is the church recapturing the importance of how we see wealth and stewardship biblically and approaching our money from a biblical perspective and understanding it's a deeply moral issue. How I spend my money matters immensely to God. If I spend more than I make, he really cares about that. And if I steward it poorly, he really does care about that. And so I'm hoping we can see that trend in the culture and in the church. All of these issues as moral issues, but specifically, we got to talk more about money and what God has to say about it. Because as you've drawn out, the implications of neglecting that and then abandoning that are serious, significant detrimental consequences if we just abandon that altogether.
Yeah, I mean, last fall I spoke at Trinity Bible Chapel on a topic that was given to me at a conference that they had there on building and stewarding wealth. And actually, there's a booklet that should be coming out of Founders Ministry from that presentation in the next few weeks or so. But what I point out is that we are actually mandated by God to build wealth. Okay, this is not something evil and wicked, and a lot of Christians have this aversion to actually building wealth. Of course, what we do with the wealth and being a proper steward of it is critical, but we are to have dominion and we are to build things. We're to build our institutions. We're to invest in our schools, our next generation, our hospitals, businesses, production, to alleviate poverty, to help those that are the poor. I mean, you can't do that unless you produce excess. And so the Bible throughout the scripture is God's given us this world which is amazingly resourceful. I mean, it's an amazing world. Even Elon Musk, a secular person, says that this world has enough resources to be able to support 4 times the population that we have now. I mean, the resources are immense. And so we are to build the wealth, and God gives us that mandate as human beings to have the dominion and to go out and to produce, to increase our standards of living. Nothing wrong with that at all. We can be thankful for the last couple hundred years, the Industrial Revolution, which has raised the standards of living and lifted people out of poverty, probably at a rate which we've never seen in history across the world because of the whole energy transformation, fossil fuels, and so forth. And these are all good things. But if you want to deindustrialize, you turn into a pagan culture. So if you want to go down the route of rejecting Christ, rejecting the lordship of Christ, and you want to worship the earth and so forth, what the irony there is, you'll actually deindustrialize and you'll go back to a substandard living. And that's what we see happening with all this green agenda and the cost structure going up and people getting squeezed and standards of living dropping and so forth. And this is precisely what we see south of the border, where the Trump administration is trying to deeply reverse that and actually get back to producing and controlling your strategic assets and being manufacturers again. And
Well,
but this,
look at where Christianity has touched down in the world. Like if I would invite anyone, just look at a map of the world, and point out the countries where you see not only the elevation of wealth and the dealing with poor, and also the elevation of rights and protections for women and children and the vulnerable, but where you see flourishing and blessing and industrialization, and where you see growth in medicine and in education, where you actually see a society that is fruitful and flourishing and for the good of its population. And then you say, now I want to look at the nations that have gone the other way, where rights, freedoms, and protections drop, where economically it's total tyranny, where you just have the super uber rich and then everyone else is poor, where disease is rampant, where education is detrimental. And basically, what you're looking at is a map of where Christianity has taken root and where the vestiges of Christianity still remain, or where Christianity has never taken root, or where the vestiges have been removed altogether, such as in places like Africa and the Middle East, where at one point maybe there's a Christian root there that then is summarily excised by Islam, for example. I mean, what Islam did to Iran and Iraq, you can look at photos and videos of a lot of Middle Eastern countries in the 60s and 70s, and you can see, hey, they're kind of westernized. And then now they look like war zones. And that's not primarily because of the United States, it's because they're just wholesale rejection of Christ and embrace of Islam. But what you're saying is that's what you're saying. Just look at the world where
mhm.
God's principles are valued and elevated. You see all this blessing and you see all this flourishing, and then where they never take root or where they're rejected and removed, it's the other way. right? It's uncreation, it's undominion, and it's deindustrializing, and it just leads to more poverty, more chaos, more war. That's clearly the case historically. Anyone who's being honest will see that that's the story of the world as it pertains to Christianity influencing cultures and societies. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, it looks like we're what it means for us is it looks like we've been doing a good job of removing God's principles and God's word from our society, which is why we've been moving in the direction we have, because we could point and see tremendous blessing not that long ago,
Mhm.
but apparently we're running away from God, and that's why we're running into all sorts of calamity.
Yeah, and one of the most important virtues is delayed gratification, thinking longer term, and that's something, of course, which is at the heart of Christianity. Is that we think very long term. We think in terms of eternity. I mean, we're trying to build up our treasure in heaven, and we do that by being long term thinkers here and subjecting our thoughts to Christ. And so, delayed gratification and savings and profits are critical to long term growth. And so, when you get an education system. We see this in the United States. You see it in Canada also, where some of the young people are going after socialism again and so forth. They say, well, we want to get rid of the profit incentive and savings. No, the heart of your economy must be savings and profits. It's those profits that get reinvested. You create surplus. You're very disciplined with your money so that you're efficient with your capital. You're not wasteful like the government, and then you create a surplus. That surplus gets invested back in the country, back in the company, back into capital, back into new technologies, back into research and development, back into innovation, and that compounds. Now you start taking that out of the system and you build in inefficiencies, which we have seen in spades in Canada. You see government bureaucracy. You see, instead of the private sector building a pipeline for X number of dollars, the government will do it, and it turns out to be 4X, four times the cost. And you get these cost overruns, and people say, well, the government doesn't have to make a profit, but it just squanders the wealth. There's no accountability. And competitive markets are what we need in a fallen world, because man needs that edge of the sword in his back a little bit, needs that pressure to exceed, to be successful, to compete against someone else. That's a good thing. And so people again don't appreciate the power of a competitive market in creating wealth and also being accountable to wealth. And a competitive market will be much more virtuous because people have to build products that clients want, and
Right.
they have to meet their needs. And if it's just like
And
you're not
love
going
their
to
neighbor. You got to love your neighbor by actually producing something that benefits them, that they want, that they're going to pay for.
exactly. And you're not going to go back to a store if they don't treat you well and so forth. And so there's a forced, lifting up of people and respecting people and attending to people's needs and focusing, as you say, on loving your neighbor much more in a free market economy. You get none of that in a socialist economy. We see that, just unfortunately. And again, I don't mean to be a wise guy. Start going into our hospitals and you see the decay in our socialized medicine here in Canada, and you'll see how well you're treated. And again, we have some wonderful nurses, wonderful doctors, but the bureaucracy has just taken over, and they can't even, in many cases, they can't even express the love and attention that you need in our healthcare system anymore, and so forth. And it just gets squashed completely out of the system, and so on. So these are all, again, moral, ethical issues. They all get back to your worldview and who is man, and of course valuing mankind. We live in the age too. If you devalue man, which we've seen the massive devaluation of humanity, one of the, as you know very well, one of the biggest issues facing the theologians in Christianity today is, who is man? Who are we, and why are we valuable? I mean, but we can only answer that with the scriptures and the way that God values us. We're made in the image of God, and we're infinitely valuable, and we're so valuable that God sent his son into the world to die for us and to take away our sin if we put our faith and trust in him, and so forth. I mean, these puts an immeasurable value on human beings. We're not just like the trees. We're not just biodiversity where everything's the same equal value, which is what they're promoting in the green agenda in our universities. Andrew, you're no more valuable than an animal or a tree for that matter. And so you can't touch the tree and hurt anything, and we can't be, again, having dominion over the rest of the creation. And so when you start going down that road, the whole thing just comes apart. And that's where we're kind of at now. We're sort of at crossroads in this country with deficits, debt, not valuing man, not understanding the creation mandate at all, worshiping the earth in terms of the whole green thing, the ESG, and all of that. And yeah, we need a massive revival, a great awakening across this country.
And this is why the scriptures matter. This is why all of the word of God for all of life, bringing the scriptures to bear in all areas, why this matters, because the not just the value of humans, but really our role and our mandate is humans. And so if I mean you don't get out of the first two chapters of Genesis before you realize that here's God who creates, right? So he creates, he's creative, he's producing, he's fruitful in a sense. And then what that creation looks like is it looks like forming and then filling, right? So he forms an earth and then he fills it, right? And so the first 3 days of creation, he forms, we'll say, biomes, right? He forms space, he forms the water in the sky, and then he forms the earth. And then on day 4, 5, and 6, he fills them. He fills the sky with stars, and then he fills space with stars. He fills the sky and the water with birds and fish, and then he fills the land with animals. And then at the apex of that is he says to humans, essentially, okay, go do the same, right? So I'm a creator. I fill, I form. That's what I do. And that's what he does in all of life, right? When a person hears the gospel, what does the Lord do? He fills them with his spirit and then he forms them into the image of Christ, right? So this filling and forming motif, this is God's operation in all of history. And so he creates humans and he says, as my image bearers, go do the same, right? Adam and Eve, go fill the earth with people so that they form it and make it beautiful, right? Take your children, fill them with the truth of God's word, and then form them in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And so if we see human beings, not it's an oversimplification, but we are agents of production and creation. This is We've been made and commissioned by God to create and to produce and to fill and to form. Yes, children. Yes, in a moral sense, but also it's impossible to separate that from the reality that we have been made to produce things, to make beautiful things, to go into the earth and to find beautiful things to make and create and to produce and to be fruitful. And to your point, if we say that human beings are no different than monkeys or trees, they are not tasked with production, at least not anything more than an automatic production in the way the trees produce oxygen that we need to breathe. But no other created thing, nothing else in all of physical creation uniquely produces and creates and forms in the way that we do. So if we say that we're no different than them, then that responsibility and really what we are commanded to by God to do, well, we can just neglect that. So, dude, you can just stay at home. You don't have to work. You can just collect your UBI because you're whatever. You're just a cog in the wheel. But we reject that. We say, no, no, no. You haven't been made to just suckle on the government teat. You've been made to build and create, whether that's starting a business or whether that's being employed and working hard and using your strength and your sweat. And then that turns into a reward and a payment for your work. We've been made for that. And the more we move away from that, the more chaotic our culture becomes. Absolutely.
Yeah, agreed 100%, Andrew.
Yeah.
That's a great summary.
So what's the way out? I mean, I want to ask this question in two different ways. Here's the first bit of the question. Let's suppose that you either have the ear of our prime chameleon, Maximum Carnage, you have his ear, or for some reason you're appointed to the Minister of Finance, or let's assume you happen to be prime minister for 24 hours before you're assassinated, right? You got a 24-hour window period before you know, they Epstein you. So what is the way out for Canada, right? Imagine you had a 24-hour period. I mean, obviously it'd be great if you had more, but what things would you put in place, right? So you couldn't get everything done in a day, but what are the top three things that you would look at in your estimation and your expertise that the best way for Canada out of this spiral of economic collapse and this currency erosion, what are the one, two, or three things that we would need to implement or work toward, that by putting these three things in place or by removing these things, we are on the right path to dealing with our, and let's presuppose moral changes, right? So let's presuppose we don't, support sodomy and the murder of preborn babies. So let's put that aside. We're dealing just in fiscal economic realities. What are the three things we do or we remove to get Canada where it needs to be?
Yeah, number one would be significantly reduce the size of the state. Number one, so you'd have to take a chainsaw to the bureaucracy. You'd want to privatize significant parts of the estate, both on the federal and provincial level. And so, number one, would be the size of the state is way too large, and it's just causing lots of problems. Second, you'd want to free up development of our resources. So you'd want to reverse some of the policies that Trudeau, in particular, put in, Prime Minister Trudeau, over the last number of years, so that you could make it easy for private money to come in and develop our natural resources. That is critical. We're not going to be able to produce the wealth if we don't go back to extracting and using our natural resources. That would be the second item, and then third, would be taxation. That would be significant reduction in taxation, in particular, taking taxation off capital. I think it's immoral to have a capital gains tax. Capital gains, you've already paid taxes already many times before it gets into capital, but that's what is the grease for the engine of the economy. And so those would be the state, taxation policy, and then freeing up as dramatically as possible our resources so that private money could come in and develop them as quickly as possible. Even what Carney's doing right now, he says he's going to work on some projects. First of all, it's probably going to take way too long. Secondly, it's still top down. It should be done through the private sector. Danielle Smith, I think, has a much better idea, obviously, on how that should be done. We should get the government out of these projects. They are just too inefficient, too bureaucratic, too regulated, and you can still have it, again, properly regulated and so forth, but it should be done in the private sector. Those three things alone would unleash an awful lot of economic strength. And what we're seeing down in south of the border, a lot of people are dumping on Trump, and the way he goes about things might not be the way that we would go about things in terms of his mannerisms. But the policies, what is he doing? He's making it easier for big projects to get done. He's got the EPA under Lee Zeldin, and they're making dramatic changes so that you can get projects done in a matter of weeks and months instead of a decade. He's lowered the cost of capital, so money is coming into the country. He's giving them incentives. He's actually allowing businesses to write off their capital investments in the first year. So again, there's tax benefits there. All of these are why is he doing this? Because he understands that it's capital, it's going to drive the economy. If you can bring in more money, it gets invested in new plants, facilities, research, development, innovation, then that's going to drive economic growth, including a lot of the investments that they're making in AI, which again is going to be, somewhat, that can be controversial. There's going to be some pros and cons to that, but all of those are going to drive productivity and increased economic growth. And that's exactly what we should be doing in Canada.
So that's the way out for Canada. So the second part of the question then would be, maybe not what's the way out for individuals, but here you have individual Canadians, you have Christians in this country who, whether they own their business or whether they're working for another employer, they're thinking about where things are going economically. They're surveying the landscape. They're listening to this conversation. They're having to deal with, looming realities that appear to be pretty serious. What's the way out for them? Or another way of saying it would be, what decisions can they make? What things can they do and implement that they're currently not doing, or what's something they might maybe want to stop doing or get rid of that they are doing, in order to help them as much as possible? Because we believe that even if the broader Canadian landscape suffers an economic collapse, that if people who love the Lord obey him faithfully, that doesn't necessarily mean that we will share the same fate to the same extent as our country. That history is full of God's people who are faithful to him, and in his mercy, because of their obedience and faithfulness, he's gracious in sparing them the calamity that falls upon the other nation. This was the case with Israel during Egypt. right? There was always light in the land of Goshen. This was the case with the early church, with the destruction of Jerusalem and then the eventual collapse of the Roman Empire, that God spared his people the full calamity, right? There's still, you may not get scratch free, but in his mercy, his people don't experience the full calamity that falls upon the broader nation because they're faithful and obedient. And that's our hope. And we see God's work that way historically. So, what can Christians do to position themselves best so that if the worst should happen to our country economically, we will be as best positioned and as good a steward as we can be, and in the hopes that God in his mercy will spare us what's coming for Canada.
Well, one of the things that you said in your lead up to that question is faithfulness and obedience. And so we need to follow the biblical principles, even when we think we shouldn't. And look, I deal with a lot of Christians that come into my office, and I'm often surprised, even by some that have been in the ministry, who really they just sort of hit the panic mode. Everything's going to collapse. Everything's going to die. I'm thinking, but you're Christians. You're supposed to have faith in God. You're supposed to be looking long term. And so the first thing is stick to the biblical principles regardless of the noise around us. And those principles are to make sure that your outflow is less than your inflow, right? And to run a balanced budget in your home, to make sure that when you're using debt, it's only used to, back up a hard asset. You need to buy a home or something like that, but you're doing that responsibly. So you're careful about how much debt you have. If you are indebted beyond what is reasonable. Of course, you're controlled by the person who's you're a slave to the creditor, the person who's giving you the credit. And so that's a problem. So number one, be disciplined, be careful, don't live beyond your means, have a budget, then start saving. And even if it's a small amount, you should be saving a little bit. Even as I say, even if it's $25 a week, build the discipline in to have some savings. That savings should be go into good, strong assets. And it should be diversified. So that could be into, again, find an advisor, word advisor. So I'm not trying to drum up some business, but places where it's going to go into some good businesses, good companies. I think some good silver, gold, some of the alternative assets. You talk. I don't follow Bitcoin as much. We have some clients that have it, but that's again an alternative asset that again can maybe protect people from the ongoing problems that we have out there. So you want to diversify those. So you don't have all your eggs in just one basket. You want to be approximately right based upon God's principles rather than precisely wrong, right? And so you again try to have hard assets that are harder to print because there's a limited number of them. When I talk about hard assets, and you're talking about like real estate, you're talking about silver, gold, things that are limited in value, limited, I should say, in quantities. You just can't produce them, and even scarcity and necessary. Scarcity and necessary, because those things tend to hold value over time. As the currency might collapse, and when it comes back, those get revalued back up to what they should be again. And so that's when you're talking about if you're prudent, you're careful, you can make it collapse a lot less painful on yourself if you're disciplined through it. Think about starting a business, invest in yourself, in your education, be entrepreneurial. See if you can to provide services to your neighbors that they need, and will pay for and so forth. So those just really get back to basics, but don't panic. Again, I really gets frustrating. We see in our office occasionally. Most of our clients are fantastic. I mean, they're Christian clients. They're wonderful. They're disciplined. There's good stewards. They're giving back to the church. That's the other thing I would say. Make sure you're tithing and giving to the Lord's work. You have to give to the Lord. I've spoken about this before. He should get the first fruits of the increase. So God, we give God off the top, not off the bottom, and that's critical. And that's again not because God is prosperity gospel, but that's because we're being faithful to God, remembering that everything comes from Him in the first place. These are all His possessions. Ultimately, we're just handlers of them. We're stewards for the time that we're here on earth, but these are ultimately the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, as we read in Psalm 24 and so forth. So yeah, discipline, budget, Don't spend beyond your means. Be careful about debt, especially, and and make sure that again you're being entrepreneurial and invest and diversify in good, solid assets. Don't be speculating, and don't try to take any shortcuts.
So you might not be trying to drum up business for yourself, but I certainly am trying to drum up business for you guys because I mean I've said this on the show. It's no surprise to anyone. You guys handle my investments, my RRSP, my RESP, my savings for my family, my future. You guys handle that for me. I don't trust anyone else more than you guys at Rocklinc, and part of it is because I know, and I've had this experience before, that if I'm in town and drop in, we can sit down for a coffee, whether it's you or whether it's Jacob. Like, these are Christian brothers and they're trustworthy. So that's one reason. But also because, like I said at the very beginning, I can't imagine another firm or individual in a financial management world that's going to be releasing articles like this and approaching things from a biblical worldview and having the word of God as supreme. And these are exactly the sort of people that I want to, and I want others to align with and partner with, um, because God's made the world to work a certain way. And the more we line up our lives with his design, the better for us. And as you've said, that's not a prosperity gospel thing. That is a sowing and reaping thing. That is a God blesses obedience. This is no surprise to people who read the Bible that God clearly blesses obedience. So with that in mind, so rocklink.com is a website people can go. Where else can people follow, whether it's you individually or Rocklink on social media? Give all the details for people to connect with you and follow what you're doing.
Yeah, the best again is our website, which is as you pointed out, Rocklink, link with a C at the end of link, rocklink.com. And if you want to contact us, info@rocklink.com, and that's got all of our particulars on there. I'm on Twitter. We put things up on Twitter, Rocklink. I should actually get all of those. I want to start throwing out the handles, but we actually do have a Twitter handle, and we're on I think Instagram and a few Facebook and so forth also. So we are on the social media if you look us up, Rocklink. Yeah. And the good thing about Rocklink is it's a unique word that's not used very much. Of course, it's spelled slightly different. And so once you hit Rocklink and Jonathan Wellum, you're gonna get everything there. If you want to be on our mailing list, even if you're not a client, then you can jump on our mailing list and subscribe to that on our website, or send a note in and ask us to add it. And we do try to send out all of the different times when different people in the company are speaking, or different articles, things like that, so you can get a constant flow of information. And in the fall, in September, late September, early October, we're looking at launching an active exchange traded fund that'll be traded on the Toronto stock market. So they call that an ETF, and that'll be a way that people, if they just want to get our expertise without necessarily coming in as full clients, they can be able to buy a product that we'll be managing with all of the same investment principles that we use in our business. So we're excited about that. That'll also allow Americans can also come up and purchase some of that too. So
Okay. Jonathan, as always, thank you so much. Great to catch up and to talk with you, to get your perspective on things. I think it's we're looking at what's happening in our country. The writing is on the wall. The behemoth beast of debt has been growing, and it can only support its weight on its skinny little legs for so long. And so Canadians need to think critically and biblically, and you're always helpful with that. And I appreciate that. And I'm sure our audience appreciates that as well. So thanks for joining me on Liberty Dispatch interviews. It's always a
thank you
pleasure.
very much, Andrew. Again, appreciate the work of Liberty Dispatch, and you and Matt. So thank you very much for the work that you're doing.
Liberty Dispatch has been brought to you by SDG Media. If you want to stay in touch with us and all things Liberty Dispatch, join our email list, or support the show, head over to ldcanada.substack.com.